Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's Power Parsha Pearls. You know that there are essentially two types of mitzvot that we have in the Torah. There are statutes that we otherwise identify as, or what we might describe as, supra-rational principles. Principles, in other words, that are part of God's law, but we don't necessarily understand the reason for it. For example, the laws of kosher. We know that God prescribes exactly how we are to conduct our Jewish diet, but we don't really understand in any way as to the significance of which animals are or are not kosher, or frankly, why you can't mix milk and meat, etc. Similarly, the idea of not mixing wool and linen together in a garment. Again, it's a statute. It's what we would call a super-rational principle, and as much as we don't understand the underlying rationale for why it is that we do it, but be that as it may, it's a law. The Torah offers no reason because they defy human comprehension. Ultimately, we do them because God says so. You know, when we were proclaimed as God's chosen nation in the portions of these past weeks, as the Jewish people assumed their status as a faith, as a religion, as a nation, it was on account of two words. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do, and we will listen. That is to say, the starting point is committing to doing, even before it has meaning to you, even before it appeals to your sensibility. Thus to state, as some do, that I will not observe mitzvot until I first understand the deeper meaning behind them is essentially only serving the sense of self. It's presumptuous arrogance, and it is essentially a denial not only of divine authority and of Torah, but of the most fundamental premise of any religion in general. Because religion, by definition, is about what God wants from you, not what can I get out of God. It's about the nasa, we will do, before the nishma, before we go on to discussing about listening and hearing and understanding. Just one example of many. There's a mitzvah, of course, to give tzedakah, to give charity. Not just any amount, but a minimum of 10% of your earnings. Now, to some, that might sound a little bit insane. I just closed a deal. I earned myself 100 grand. I have to give away 10 grand to charity? I earn $200,000 a year. I have to give 20,000 of that to charity. It makes no sense. 3,000, okay. 5,000 if I'm feeling particularly generous. But to give away 10% of my hard-earned labor, that defies logic. It's unacceptable. Interestingly enough, God famously says in the book of Malachi, Ubechanuni nabazas. You wonder how you can live like that? Says God, test me and see if I won't repay you in abundance. And then as the verse continues, I'll bestow blessings upon you until more than enough, or as the Talmud adds, until your lips get tired from saying enough. In other words, God is essentially saying, do what you have to do, and I assure you that I will repay you multifold. Now, in that particular instance, God actually uniquely spells out the benefit. He tells you the implicit reward, that if you submit to doing the right thing, he spells out the payback, if you have sufficient guts and faith to take his word for it. Otherwise, why would you accept the otherwise seemingly unacceptable? And God actually even goes on to challenge us by saying, test me, see if I won't deliver. But in other instances, in most other instances, you won't necessarily know the reward. But be assured that in as much as you might consider something else unacceptable, there's again inherent benefit to you in ways that you cannot imagine. Invaluable reward as well. An undoubted advantage to your world and the world at large for doing what you need to do, even if you don't get it right now. Now, to be sure, and this has to be strongly stressed, I'm not advocating in any way that we should be programmed robots. Judaism is not a cult where you are simply expected to follow blindly and ours is not to ask why. Certainly not. The nishma, the declaration at Sinai of we will listen, implying the deeper understanding, is also critical. And that's where Hasidism comes into play, to give us a lot more understanding and appreciation of why we do what we need to do when we do that. But that's the challenge. You have to internalize as well. You have to seek, you have to explore, you have to enhance, you have to develop your understanding. You have to have an enhanced appreciation and deeper spiritual connection to what you are doing in the religious sphere. You have to explore and discover the inherent beauty of our faith. so that you can pursue your responsibilities not just as categorical imperatives or formal morality and obedience, but ultimately with a passion and with a deeper appreciation and with an internalization so that we can allow our very actions to transform our very essence. But again, the Jewish people first said nasa, we will do, and then they said nishma, we will hear, we will listen, we will absorb. The exploration must never be a prerequisite to the actual fulfillment. You cannot say, first I want to get it, and then I'll do it. No, do it, and then whilst doing it, understand the better significance of your actions. Na'aseh v'nishma. Unless you think that's a formidable task, let's all remember, every single one of us as children complied with our parents' edicts on account of 4 words. What are they? Because I said so. So you'll ask, where's the justice in that? Whatever you were being told by your parent to do made no sense to your infantile mind. In fact, everything about it might have defied our childish sense of logic. But that was enough to get us to do it regardless. But I don't want to because I said so. But why? Because I said so. That was it. You did it. And that's the same reality in regard to our relationship with God as well. We don't always get it. But then let's also remember what Mark Twain famously said. When I was 17 years old, my father was so foolish and so ignorant, I could not stand to have the old man around. When I turned 21, I was amazed as to how much the old man had learned in just 4 years. Interestingly enough, my father, of blessed memory, used to quote that to me often, and it now hangs as a poster in my office. But what that suggests simply is that as children, we lack a certain intellectual and emotional maturity. And as we get older, we start to maybe get it a little bit more. We learn to appreciate the rationale of mom and dad's earlier decisions, albeit when younger, it was simply because I said so. And again, in regard to our relationship with the divine and our spiritual responsibilities, we might not always get it. In fact, often we don't get it. But why treat your supreme parent any different than you treat your mortal ones? Your soul certainly gets it. So let it harness itself to your natural inclinations and steer you in the right direction. Now, that's insofar as supra-rational principles. There are, of course, many laws that are rational principles. Don't kill, help the needy, visit the sick, etc. And there, too, the Torah offers no reason, because frankly, there is no reason to. They are perfectly obvious. Nevertheless, they're part and parcel of the same Torah. Inasmuch as they are obvious, you still do them, not because they make sense to you, but because that's what God wants you to do. By definition, even if God had not instructed on those particular laws, social contract and society would have necessitated that we would have implemented these laws regardless. But still, we do them on account of the fact that they are divine edicts. And when you do them because they make sense, okay, you're a smart person. You're conducive to society. When you do them because God wants you to do them, then you're drawing an altogether different energy down into an otherwise simple task, into an otherwise basic rational principle upon yourself and upon the world around you. And here's an interesting example of this. If you take your neighbor's night garment, says the Torah, as security for a loan, then you must return it to him before sunset. Because he's going to need it at night, right? Makes sense. It's obvious. You take your friend's pajamas as security, you're going to have to let them have them back before they go to sleep at night. So why then does the Torah continue with the following? For this alone is his covering, the garment for his skin, with what else shall he sleep? Why the need to spell out in detail the perfectly obvious? What is the Torah looking to convey when telling me something that I can pretty much figure out by myself? I know the obvious reason I have to give him back his pajamas at night is because with what else is he going to sleep? Why does the Torah have to spell out the logic here? And the answer is this. You see, there's a flip side to consider in this otherwise perfectly rational principle. Granted, this may be his only pair of pajamas. Otherwise, with what shall he sleep, says the Torah. But you can ask, why is that my problem? He borrowed money from me. He gave me his one pair of purple Prada printed silk pajamas as collateral. Why should I want to give it back to him at any point prior to the repayment of my loan? Isn't that how collateral, how security works? But the point is this. Legally, I'm 100% in my rights. And that's why the Torah needs to elaborate here and tell me that there's the letter of the law and then there's going beyond the letter of law. There's being right and then there's being a mensch. An ancient example of that is how we're told about how Abraham went out. It was the famous battle between the 4 and the 5 kings. And Abraham went out to engage in that battle and risked his life in the process in order to be able to rescue his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive in that battle. So you can ask yourself the question, why did he have to do that? He didn't have to go out to battle and risk his own life to save his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive. Why does it become his problem? Halachically, rationally, it's a fair question. But here's a little detail. We're told that when God instructs Abraham to leave his father's home, to leave his land, and go to the land of Canaan, which for him at that point was a foreign place, it says in the Torah that Lot went with him. Lot wasn't told to go with Abraham. Lot chose to go with him. Lot is choosing to look after his elderly uncle, who's now being instructed by God to go and up sticks at an age of 75. So now when he's in trouble, Jewish law might say Abraham doesn't have to go and do what is necessary to help save Lot. But decency, common decency, going beyond the letter of the law says, yes, he does. So in this instance as well, the Torah instructs us super-rational principles, rational principles, but then beyond all that, learn to step out of your shoes for a moment. Put on another person's shoes. Beyond the letter of the law, learn to empathize with other people. That's a word that's lost in the world today. We know how to sympathize, but how many of us truly know how to empathize? Fascinating story. Fiorello LaGuardia, the famous mayor of New York, who sat for a record 3 terms, after whom the airport LaGuardia in New York City is named, was in fact apparently Jewish. He didn't publicize it. He was happy to let a lot of people with a name like LaGuardia or Fiorello think that he was Italian. But unlike other politicians, he sought to empathize with his townfolk. And he used to go riding in fire trucks with first responders. He used to go joining police officers on their beats. And he used to take orphan children to baseball games, etc. One freezing night in January 1935, during the depths of the Great Depression, Mayor LaGuardia came to a night court in one of the poorest areas in the city, and he told the judge to take the night off, and he decided to preside over the court. And a short time later, as the story goes, an old woman dressed in threadbare clothing stood before him on a charge of stealing a loaf of bread. And he asked, did you steal the loaf of bread? And he was known, by the way, to mete out very tough justice when he sometimes sat in these courts. She said she did, and explained that her sick daughter and the 2 grandchildren had been abandoned. They had nothing to eat. They would die from starvation if she had not shoplifted that loaf of bread. LaGuardia turned to the shopkeeper and said, given the circumstances, do you really want to press charges? And the shopkeeper felt sorry for the woman, but then said to the mayor, this is a bad neighborhood, and that this woman needs to be punished just to set an example for everybody else. So Mayor LaGuardia has a dilemma. Under the law, the woman was guilty. She has to be punished. Given her reason for committing the crime, to punish her would seem to be an injustice. The textbook penalty for shoplifting is $10 or 10 days in jail. What would you do if you were the judge? You know what he did? He fined the woman $10. Justice is justice, he declared. A thief has to be fined. Of course, if you haven't got the money, he said, you would have to go to jail. But then he did something that stunned the entire courthouse. He took out a $10 bill from his wallet and gave it to the woman to pay her fine. And then he looked around the crowded, bustling courtroom and fined everybody there 50 cents for living in a city in which a grandmother had to steal a loaf of bread to feed her grandchildren. And then he directed the bailiff to collect the fines and hand the money to the defendant. The total collected was $47.50, including the 50 cents willingly paid by the shopkeeper as well. And that poor woman, who was led to the court to face charges, was overwhelmed. She just received a gift of $47.50. And after everybody paid the fine, they gave Mayor LaGuardia a standing ovation. What does that story tell you and me? Legally, he didn't have to do so. He could have enforced the law, as the book says, that's that. But like the Torah is telling the lender in the law that I refer to, I need you to experience for a few moments the end result. This is his only garment. You can take it from him. You can claim you're right, but the bottom line is, with what shall he sleep? You can keep his garment overnight. It's your legal right, but when the sun sets and you see that garment in your closet and you know that this borrower has nothing to sleep with tonight, will you be able to fall asleep? How relevant is that in our lives? I don't know. You have a disagreement with somebody, and you might know that you're 100% in the right. In fact, the person with whom you are having the disagreement knows it too. Everybody knows you're right. But is asserting your sense of right necessarily right? Sometimes You have to listen to those words. For this alone is his covering, the garment for his skin, with what shall he sleep? Doesn't mean you're wrong. It means that you and I have to cultivate the art of empathy, to understand, to appreciate what that person is going through, even if they are wrong, even if they made the wrong decisions, even if their behavior was irresponsible or even negligent. All of that might be true. But before I make my final decision, I need to consider one question. With what shall he sleep? What will this do for him or her? What will be the end result? What will I end up with, and what will they end up with? In conflict resolution, it's rarely about right and wrong. He's right, she's wrong. On the other hand, or the other way around, it's not how you solve or resolve an issue. Empathy begins with understanding life from the other person's perspective. Nobody has an objective experience of reality. It's all through our own individual prisms. It's about each seeing the other side and accepting that this is their reality, even if you cannot see it, or even if you cannot see how anyone else could live in such a reality. Of course, it doesn't mean you allow yourself always to be manipulated. You protect yourself against that. What it means is to never allow justice to blind you to the experience of another human being. Have the courage and the dignity and the self-esteem to consider the fate of the other person, the reality of the other person, the experience of the other person, and make a decision, not from a place of cold justice, but by finding echoes of the other person in your own soul. And the ultimate message, therefore, is that insofar as all Torah and all mitzvot are concerned, the bottom line remains there are super-rational principles. We don't always get it. There are rational principles. Don't do them just because that makes sense. But above all else, there's menschlichkeit. There is going beyond the letter of the law in empathy for other people. That makes up the whole beautiful gambit of God's divine law. Wishing you all